This wasn't just trench warfare and shelling. It wasn't only bayonets and razor wire doing the killing. World War I was a financial war too, fought in vault rooms, on trading floors, inside central banks, and in the private offices of money men who never saw a single battlefield. The soldiers bled. But the bankers and politicians? They were running the numbers. And what they pulled off in those years didn't just decide who won, it completely rewired how global finance works in ways that are still bleeding you dry today. Think war is just politics and soldiers? Think again. The Great War proved money is a weapon, one of the most lethal ever unleashed. By 1914, Europe was a pressure cooker ready to blow. Nationalist feuds, empire building, and tangled military pacts had turned the continent into one big paranoid chess match. But underneath all the grand speeches about honor and glory, there was cold financial math. You can't fight a war this big without absolutely staggering amounts of cash. Here's the ugly truth. When leaders picked war, they were picking debt. Every empire sending troops to the front was simultaneously sending its own people into a future crushed by economic weight. Still, when this thing kicked off, most governments thought it'd be quick, over by Christmas maybe. They figured they could bankroll it the traditional way. Gold, some modest borrowing, patriotic fundraising. Within weeks, that fantasy evaporated. The war was torching money faster than anyone thought possible. Let's get specific. Summer of 1914. Europe's financial system still ran on the gold standard. Countries guaranteed their paper currency could be swapped for real gold, a system that made money credible but also handcuffed governments. Gold reserves were limited. You couldn't just print forever without your people and creditors losing faith. Britain, France, Germany, they all had decent reserves. But once millions got mobilized and factories switched to weapons production, costs went vertical. Germany alone was burning through over 10 million marks a day by late 1914, and Britain's war tab would hit £2.5 million every single day. The math was brutal. The gold wasn't going to last. So governments hit pause on the rules. One after another, the major powers ditched the gold standard, quietly telling their citizens that money was now basically just a promise backed by nothing except trust in the state. That moment, when they cut the gold anchor loose, ranks as one of the biggest financial pivots in modern times. It exposed how fragile the so-called real wealth of nations actually was. Money and power broke free from metal and got driven by printing presses, credit lines, and smooth talking. And once governments got a taste of that freedom, they never looked back. Now the real financial war kicked in. Germany, cut off from global money markets and strangled by the British naval blockade, had only one play: borrow from its own people. Berlin launched huge bond campaigns, playing the patriotism card hard, pushing ordinary citizens to dump their savings into war loans. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. Heroic soldier posters. Families told to sacrifice comfort for the homeland. Constant promises that investors would get paid back after victory. All told, Germany pulled in over 100 billion marks this way, but it was a house of cards built on hope. When defeat came, those bonds became worthless. Millions of Germans watched their life savings vanish, and that bitterness became rocket fuel for extremism in the decades that followed. Economic wounds leave scars. Britain had one massive edge. The City of London was the world's financial nerve center. Sterling was solid, and British financial networks stretched worldwide. At first, the government relied on short-term borrowing, treasury bills, and patriotic appeals, but soon enough it tapped into deeper pools of global credit. The game changer, turning to the United States. In 1914, America was officially neutral, but its bankers saw opportunity written all over this thing. Firms like J.P. Morgan and Co. became the financial foredrip keeping Britain and France alive, arranging massive loans and handling purchases of weapons, food, raw materials. By 1917, when America actually joined the war, Wall Street had already been financing the Allied side for years. This wasn't charity. This was power. American bankers raked in millions in fees, and the United States came out of the war completely transformed, from debtor to creditor, from financial sidekick to global heavyweight. Want to know how the 20th century became America's century? It starts right here, not on the battlefields, but in the account books. France had its own nightmare. Already drained from building defenses and haunted by memories of the Franco-Prussian War, It leaned heavily on loans, both domestic and foreign. French citizens, historically big savers, got convinced to buy government bonds. But the serious money again came from across the Atlantic. France, like Britain, got increasingly hooked on American capital. That dependency would shape post-war politics when debts piled up and repayment turned toxic. When people talk about the interwar economic mess, remember, it wasn't just about reparations or stock crashes, it was about the crushing debt load. Built up during 4 years of industrial slaughter, Russia's financial war was a complete disaster. The empire was huge but backwards, its banking system shaky. And its gold reserves looked good on paper, but fell short in reality. To fund its war machine, Russia borrowed massively from allies, especially France. But as battlefield losses mounted and inflation exploded, confidence in the ruble collapsed. By 1917, the Russian economy was rubble, and the political system imploded with it. The fall of the Tsarist regime wasn't just about ideology or incompetent generals. It was about a financial system stretched beyond breaking. Economic blunders, monetary chaos, and runaway inflation fueled revolution. Once again, money and power marched together into the history books. The scale of financial destruction was mind-blowing. By war's end, Allied powers had burned through over $140 billion, while the Central Powers spent around $60 billion. These were numbers the world had never seen, many times larger than the total pre-war national incomes of everyone involved. The result wasn't just debt mountains, but the total demolition of the old financial order. The gold standard, once the bedrock of global trust, was shattered. Inflation ravaged economies. Germany soon faced hyperinflation so insane that a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. And regular people, workers, savers, small-time investors, they're the ones who got crushed. The wealthy elite, meanwhile, protected themselves by moving assets overseas, buying tangible goods, staying plugged into power centers where information leaked first. The lesson was harsh but crystal clear. In a financial war, the little guy bleeds first. Here's what connects to you today. World War I was when governments figured out they could finance the impossible by disconnecting money from reality. They learned they could abandon gold, print endlessly, sell bonds to their own citizens, borrow internationally, then patch up the wreckage later with propaganda and restructuring. Sound familiar? Because this playbook never went away. Every modern crisis, the Great Depression, the 2008 financial meltdown, echoes. 1914. When governments or central banks swear this is temporary or the fundamentals are strong, remember, they were saying identical things in 1914 and millions believed them, right up until the currency in their wallets turned worthless. When the guns finally stopped in 1918, the world resembled a battlefield not just in the trenches but on balance sheets. The United States, formerly a debtor nation, now held the world's biggest gold reserves and the biggest creditor position in history. Europe, the old financial heartland, was drowning in debt. Britain owed America over $4 billion. France owed more than $3 billion. And even smaller countries were tangled in obligations they could never realistically clear. The war transformed Wall Street into the planet's new financial command center, displacing London in a way no artillery barrage could have. The era of American dominance in money and power had arrived. But this wasn't smooth sailing. Here's the trap. When wars get funded through borrowing, repayment becomes its own war. Britain and France, desperate to honor commitments to citizens who'd bought war bonds, now had to squeeze money out of Germany through reparations. The Treaty of Versailles demanded an astronomical figure minus 132 billion gold marks. It was designed to punish, to cripple, to dump the burden on the losers. But it was also pure fantasy. Germany simply couldn't pay. Every attempt, whether printing money or shipping goods, destabilized its economy further. The 1923 hyperinflation, when Germans hauled wheelbarrows of worthless bills just to buy bread, wasn't some accident. It was the direct result of a financial system pushed over the edge by impossible debt. And it planted rage that extremists harvested later. Meanwhile, Britain tried restoring financial prestige by returning to the gold standard in 1925, pegging the pound at its old pre-war value. This was another economic blunder of staggering magnitude. The British economy was wrecked, its industrial base weakened, its debts towering. Forcing the pound back to its old level was like jamming a broken bone back into place without letting it heal first. The result: deflation, unemployment, social unrest. The policy, pushed by figures like Winston Churchill, is now remembered as one of the worst financial miscalculations in modern economic history. And again, ordinary workers paid the price while elites clung to fantasies of restored greatness. The United States, swimming in gold and credit, faced a different puzzle: what to do with this new dominance. American banks started pumping money back into Europe, lending to Germany so Germany could pay reparations to Britain and France, who could then pay back America. It was a financial merry-go-round that looked stable on the surface but ran on circular logic. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and Young Plan of 1929 institutionalized this flow. Money was getting recycled, not created. When the global economy seized up during the Great Depression, the whole structure collapsed. The world had never been more financially interconnected and never more fragile. That's why World War I isn't just another chapter in military history. It was an economic turning point where financial mistakes and illusions rewrote the future. The war demonstrated governments could ditch gold, inflate currencies, and borrow at unprecedented levels, while still convincing citizens they were doing the right thing. It proved propaganda could transform debt into patriotism. Ordinary savers could be talked into surrendering wealth for bonds that would never pay out. In wars, real winners were often boardroom guys, not trench fighters. Money and power got welded together tighter than ever, and the world's been living with the fallout ever since. Think about your life right now. When central banks promise inflation is temporary, when governments jack up debt ceilings year after year, when new money gets conjured digitally with a keystroke, remember 1914. Remember the gold standard wasn't abandoned accidentally but deliberately. In desperation. Remember this pattern: borrowing against tomorrow, printing to cover today, selling bonds wrapped in patriotic slogans is over a century old. Every modern financial crisis traces roots back to those war years, from 1970s stagflation to the 2008 subprime collapse. The same illusions are still running. And the same people, everyday savers, middle-class workers, small investors, still get asked to sacrifice. The hidden financial battle behind World War I isn't ancient history. It's the foundation of today. The lesson is harsh but essential. Money, once cut loose from reality, becomes a manipulation tool. Governments will always find ways to finance wars, bailouts, crises, and they'll always find ways to make you pay for it, through taxes, inflation, or the slow erosion of your savings. Real wealth isn't numbers on screens or politician promises. Real wealth is resilience, knowledge, and seeing through illusions. That's the only financial freedom history permits. Here's the final thought to take with you. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The financial playbook written in 1914 has been recycled again and again, dressed up in fresh language, justified with new excuses. But the outcome stays the same. The powerful protect themselves, and those without knowledge get sacrificed. If you take one thing from this story, make it this: never assume money is real just because it's printed, and never assume the system is stable just because authorities say so. Truth always hides in the balance sheets, and history is the only teacher that won't lie to you. If this shifted your perspective, hit subscribe. History holds the answers. I'll show you where to find them.